Well, good afternoon and welcome to our Quest Club meeting for October 31st. Thank you for being here and happy Halloween to all. I unfortunately live out in the country, so I never get any kids show up. But it's fun when I lived in Boston. We're now on the 304th day of the year and have 60 days left in 2025. On October 31st in history, Nevada became the 36th state in 1864, and work on Mount Rushmore was completed in 1941. Other notable events include Martin Luther's posting his 95 Thesis in 1517, and the Lincoln Highway, which you have out here, the first transcontinental highway in the U.S., is dedicated in 1913. Today's invocation will be given by Diana Jackson.
My motto is to live with kindness and compassion. So that's what the invocation will be based on. So today we come together as neighbors, friends, and people who have a shared humanity of the country we live in. And as we gather today, we remember that at the founding of this nation, a vision in which leadership was not about power, but about responsibility to people. We recognize that it doesn't begin with authority, but with responsibility to one another. It grows from trust, from listening, and from the simple belief that our communities deserve the best. May we approach these days and days to come with steady purpose, to live voices that go unheard, to bridge divides rather than widen them, and to seek understanding before judgment. Let kindness be our starting point, our compassion, our daily practice, not out of obligation, but out of recognition that a community thrives when we see each other, when we see one another's dignity and worth. May we be patient in disagreement, courageous in decision, and generous in spirit. Let us reflect not just on what we decide, but how we choose to show up for the people around us with clarity, fairness, empathy, and commitment. And as we move forward today, may we remember that progress is not a solo effort. It is built in partnership, sustained in trust, and strengthened by every person who believes that we are capable of building something better together. So may the grace of the Lord, our God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with each one of you, all of us, forever. Amen.
Today's topic, the executive branch, founder's intent, and later expansion, is presented by Quester Karl Einolf. And let me read you his bio, if I may. Karl Einolf serves as the president of Indiana Tech. He began his tenure as president on July 1st, 2017, and he is the university's 9th president since its inception in 1930. He has a BS in mathematics with a minor in economics from Penn State University, an MS in business from Johns Hopkins University, and a PhD in business and economics from Lehigh University. Dr. Einolf came to Indiana Tech from Mount St. Mary's University in Emmitsburg, Maryland, where he served for 19 years in numerous roles. He was a faculty member there, dean of the business school, and an acting president for a short time. Prior to entering higher education, Dr. Einolf spent 5 years working for the Sprint Corporation in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and in Kansas City, Missouri, in various finance, marketing, and human resource functions. Karl is married to Maria Einolf since 1990, and together they are the proud parents of their adult sons, Nicholas and Thomas. Please join me in welcoming Karl.
When the president does it, that means it is not illegal. So said Richard Nixon in an interview with David Frost in 1977. Nixon was professing the president's constitutional right to absolute executive authority. especially in matters related to presidential privacy and secrecy. The interview took place 3 years after the Supreme Court disagreed with him and unanimously ruled that Nixon must hand over the tape recordings and documents related to the Watergate scandal. The 1974 ruling all but confirmed Nixon's decision to resign from the presidency, and he did so 2 weeks later. For the rest of his life, Nixon advocated for broader and expanded executive authority, particularly in foreign policy, national defense, and matters related to privacy and secrecy. But how did we get here? At that time, the country was almost 200 years old. Why was there uncertainty then? And why is there still uncertainty today about the powers of the presidency and the executive branch? In 1787, when our system of government was created by the Constitution, the executive branch was both the most visible and the most controversial of the three branches. The executive branch is embodied in a single individual, the president, who serves simultaneously as head of state, head of government, and commander-in-chief of the armed forces. The framers of the Constitution designed the presidency with both their hopes and their fears in mind. They hoped for energy, decisiveness, and accountability in a leader, but they also feared monarchy, tyranny, and corruption of power. Article 2 in the Constitution describes the executive branch and sparsely explains the powers of the presidency. Article 2, Section 1 begins by simply stating, "The executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America." Over the last 250 years, presidential administrations have tested the boundaries of the Constitution's provisions. From George Washington's restraint to Abraham Lincoln's wartime assertiveness to Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and World War II leadership, to today's modern presidents who claim vast administrative and military powers, the executive branch has expanded far beyond the original expectations of some of the framers. We will examine what the framers intended, and there was significant debate among the framers even after the Constitution was signed, and we will discuss how presidential power has expanded over time. The 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention had just won independence from a king. Many of them feared that vesting power in one person might recreate the abuses of King George III. During the convention, George Mason, representing the state of Virginia, warned that the presidency may easily become an elective monarchy if it is not carefully constrained. Mason was so worried about this that he chose not to sign the completed Constitution. James Madison, also from Virginia, was equally concerned about the concentration of power in one person. And he advocated that the other two branches of government, the legislature and the judiciary, must help produce a balance of power across all three branches. Madison was a signer of the Constitution and one of the authors of the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were a series of 85 essays that were written from October of 1787 to May of 1788 to build public and political support for the newly proposed Constitution and to persuade New York to ratify it. In Federalist number 47, Madison wrote, and I quote, "The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny," close quote. Others, like Alexander Hamilton, who was also a signer of the Constitution and an author of 51 of the Federalist Papers essays, argued for a strong executive. In Federalist number 70, Hamilton wrote, and I quote, "Energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government," close quote. He argued that the president needed adequate powers to protect liberty, to enforce laws, and to respond to crises. In the same publication, he added, and I quote, "A feeble executive implies a feeble execution of the government, and a government ill executed, whatever it may be in theory, must be in practice a bad government," close quote. So what does the Constitution actually say about the president's authority? There are key clauses in Article 2 that define or imply executive authority, but there are not many. The first is the vesting clause, as I previously mentioned, and that comes at the very beginning of Article 2. The executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America. This brief sentence is the core of constitutional debate on executive authority. After the Constitution was published, Hamilton argued that the sentence implied a general grant of executive authority beyond those powers that the Constitution specifically listed. Madison, however, read it more narrowly and believed that the president was limited to only those powers mentioned in the Constitution. Much of the remainder of this paper will address how the authority of the executive branch was expanded toward Hamilton's interpretation. In recent decades, scholars and officials, especially in the Reagan and the George W. Bush administrations, promoted the unitary executive theory. This view holds that all executive power belongs to the president, and therefore Congress cannot limit or direct executive officers once appointed. The view holds that the U.S. president has total authority over the executive branch and has the power to remove subordinate officials. Proponents cite the vesting clause as justification, while critics warn that this approach undermines checks and balances. There are specific powers of the presidency described in Article 2. Was it the intent of the framers of the Constitution to limit the president to only those powers, as the Madisonians believed, or was the vesting clause meant to be more expansive than that? If the vesting clause was intended to provide for more expansive power, as the Hamiltonians believed, then why bother listing all the president's specific powers in the rest of Article 2? Those powers would already be covered by the vesting clause. So this is the basis of the debate. Here are some of the specific powers of the presidency listed in Article 2 and the current debate about how much power the Constitution affords the president for each of them. In Article 2, Section 2, the Constitution states, "The President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States." This clause gives the President control of military forces, while Congress, as explained in Article 1, retains the power to declare war. This tension between legislative and executive war powers is, to this day, a continuing source of constitutional debate. Just earlier this month, when President Trump ordered attacks on drug trafficking boats in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific, the Senate Armed Services Committee asked for a legal justification of these actions from the Pentagon's chief counsel. The Trump administration designated some Latin American drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, which the Defense Department argues gave them unilateral authority to use military force against the cartels. Senator Jack Reed, however, as the top Democrat on the committee, criticized the Trump administration for offering, and I quote, "no credible legal justification, evidence, or intelligence," end quote, for the strikes. The Wall Street Journal further quoted Senator Reed, and I quote, "Every American should be alarmed that their president has decided he can wage secret wars against anyone he calls an enemy," end quote. Later in Article 2, Section 2, the Constitution states, "He shall nominate and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States." This clause establishes presidential power over personnel, which is balanced by the Senate's check. However, the clause says nothing about the removal of presidential appointees. In 1920, Frank Myers, a postmaster in Portland, Oregon, was removed from office by President Woodrow Wilson. Myers argued that his dismissal was a violation of law, and the president did not have the authority to fire him without first consulting the Senate that had confirmed his appointment. The case ultimately went to the Supreme Court. The court ruled in 1926 that the president did have the authority to dismiss officers in the executive branch. The majority argument referred to the Take Care Clause in the Constitution in Article 2, Section 3, which states, "He shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed and shall commission all officers of the United States." In the court's majority argument, the Take Care Clause was referenced as the core of the president's law enforcement and administrative power. This authority reflects the unitary executive principle. Because the president is constitutionally responsible for the execution of laws, he must be able to remove those who obstruct or defy his direction. Since 1926, the Take Care Clause has been used to reinforce the Hamiltonian belief that the president has greater executive authority over the executive branch than was the case in the earlier history of our nation. Today, it is widely understood that the Constitution provides the president with broad authority to remove executive branch officials who assist in carrying out federal law, particularly those whose duties are purely executive in nature. However, the president's removal power diminishes where Congress has created independent regulatory structures or where other constitutional protections apply. While the president may nominate Federal Reserve governors, for example, the Federal Reserve Act limits their removal to cases of for cause, meaning the president cannot fire them simply for disagreements over economic strategies and monetary policy decisions. In other areas, presidential removal authority is nearly non-existent. Supreme Court justices and federal judges may only be removed through impeachment by the House and conviction by the Senate. So the president has no direct role in their removal. Likewise, independent commissions such as the Federal Trade Commission have historically been insulated from direct presidential control. Recently, President Trump announced he was firing Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, who subsequently sued President Trump in federal court to block her firing. The Supreme Court quickly reviewed the case and ruled that Lisa Cook could remain in her job until the court takes up the case in January. The debate continues to this day, and the extent of executive authority over the Federal Reserve is still yet to be determined. Most constitutional scholars agree that executive authority is left open for interpretation in the Constitution. Even the framers ended up in two separate camps, led by Madison's and Hamilton's distinct views. Madison believed that all executive powers were detailed in the Constitution and authority should be evenly spread among the executive, legislative, and judiciary branches. Hamilton, on the other hand, believed in the need for a powerful executive and the unitary executive theory. The framers divided powers to prevent tyranny. Congress was given the power to declare war, raise revenue, and regulate commerce. The judiciary was granted independence, and the executive was checked by Senate involvement in appointments and treaties. Still, the president retained unique powers with the vesting clause, the commander-in-chief authority, and the responsibility to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Over time, there has been an expansion of authority as one presidential administration after another pushed the boundaries of authority, often with good intentions in mind, to quickly deal with a crisis, to manage a situation more efficiently, or to pursue an initiative that Congress would have otherwise blocked. In this next section, we will look at some of our presidents throughout our nation's history. Thankfully, not all 47. To provide examples of how the expansion of executive authority unfolded and how we got to a place today where the Hamiltonian unitary executive theory is more widely embraced and accepted. George Washington shaped the presidency through restraint. He created the first cabinet, emphasized collective advice, and chose to step down after 2 terms, which set a precedent until Franklin Roosevelt. However, when Washington issued his 1793 Proclamation of Neutrality, the Madisonian camp complained that he was going beyond his constitutional authority because he did not seek approval from Congress. Washington, however, believed he had the authority and could proclaim the United States' neutrality in European conflicts. Ultimately, through legislative action the following year, Washington's action was approved, and executive authority was thus expanded. Thomas Jefferson, our third president, was wary of centralized power and was strongly in the Madison camp. However, he faced a dilemma when he had the opportunity to acquire the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 for $15 million. Since the Constitution said nothing about the president's authority to purchase a new territory, Jefferson felt he needed to propose an amendment to the Constitution to get the deal done. However, he was more concerned that the opportunity would pass before an amendment could be approved by the states. He decided to move forward with the purchase and asked the Senate to ratify the deal. This action established a principle of constitutional implied powers for executive authority that ironically supported the Hamiltonian view and the unitary executive theory. For the first half of the 19th century, Congress dominated politics. Presidents generally embraced the Whig theory, which held that the president should exercise only those powers explicitly granted by the Constitution. This aligned with James Madison's view of executive authority. The Whig theory emphasized individual liberty and the need for citizens to be constantly concerned about government expanding its power and infringing on personal liberties. The Civil War, however, transformed the presidency and expanded upon the extent of executive authority during a national crisis. Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, expanded the military without congressional approval, and issued the Emancipation Proclamation as a war measure. Although he justified his actions by necessity, he was sharply criticized by many, including Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Taney. Chief Justice Taney did not believe that Lincoln had the authority to suspend habeas corpus. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution states that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended, unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. The great writ's origins go back to the signing of the Magna Carta in England in 1215, and the writ compels the government to show cause to a judge for the arrest or detention of a person. When Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, he did so to preserve the Union and to control the coming rebellion. Chief Justice Taney wrote in his opinion that, and I quote, "The clause in the Constitution which authorizes the suspension of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus is in the 9th section of the 1st article. This article is devoted to the legislative department of the United States and has not the slightest reference to the executive department." Taney argued, "I can see no ground whatsoever for supposing that the president in any emergency or in any state of things can authorize the suspension of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus," end quote. Lincoln argued back by saying he was faced with two choices: save the nation or preserve the Constitution. He did not believe he could do both. He chose to suspend habeas corpus and save the nation. It took 2 years, but Congress eventually addressed the matter and gave the president the approval to suspend the writ when public safety may require it. Again, executive authority was expanded. At the turn of the 20th century, Theodore Roosevelt articulated the stewardship theory of the presidency. He believed, more in the Hamiltonian vein, that the president had the power to do anything that was not explicitly forbidden by the Constitution. He believed that the president should act as a steward of the people, with the power to do anything necessary for the nation's well-being. This theory views executive power as expansive, taking an active role to serve the public, rather than a passive one limited to powers explicitly granted. Roosevelt used this to justify bold actions, such as breaking up trusts and creating national monuments, which he saw as his duty to ensure the common well-being of the nation. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency from 1933 to 1945 was known as the Imperial Presidency due to his expansion of presidential power during the Great Depression and World War II. He justified pushing the boundaries of constitutional executive authority by declaring national emergencies, like declaring the Great Depression a national emergency and treating it like a war, which granted him powers previously reserved for wartime. He also greatly expanded the federal bureaucracy with his New Deal programs, and he set many new precedents for future presidents. He created a larger White House staff that was not subject to congressional approval, and by doing so, he added more power to the executive branch. The mobilization for World War II further cemented the expansion of his presidential power as he acted as the nation's war leader. Before the mid-20th century, the presidency was less ideological tied to partisan polarization. Presidents like Franklin D. Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and even earlier figures like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson often governed through cross-party coalitions. Congress itself was less ideologically sorted. Both parties had liberal and conservative wings, so a president could frequently work across the aisle or within a regional faction. Starting in the 1960s, however, major social and political realignments reshaped both parties and the president's role. The Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, and later the Reagan Revolution polarized the electorate along ideological and cultural lines. The Democratic Party became increasingly associated with progressive social reform, racial justice, and government activism. The Republican Party professed the benefits of free markets, traditional values, and limited government in a conservative movement that identified the presidency as the chief guardian of the Republican cause. This ideological sorting transformed presidential politics. Modern presidents are now clear partisan symbols, expected to represent their party's entire platform rather than to govern through compromise. The presidency itself became the center of partisan identity, while Congress, the media, think Fox News and CNN, and ultimately voters became divided sharply across the same lines. Looking at the presidency today, we will examine how modern two-term presidents from each party push the boundaries of executive authority to manage the needs of the nation and to achieve political objectives. Both our Republican and Democratic presidents have expanded executive power, but they've done so in distinctly different ways. Republican presidents have tended to emphasize constitutional and philosophical justifications for a strong centralized presidency, while Democratic presidents have generally expanded the executive branch to advance policy initiatives when Congress is deadlocked. In recent times, Republican presidents have viewed the presidency through a Hamiltonian lens, emphasizing energy, decisiveness, and unity in the executive. This interpretation, rooted in the Federalist Papers No. 70, holds that effective governance requires a single, vigorous leader capable of swift, accountable action. Ronald Reagan reintroduced this constitutional philosophy during the 1980s when his Justice Department advanced formal arguments supporting the unitary executive theory. Through executive orders and the Office of Management and Budget, Reagan centralized control over federal rulemaking, and he asserted that all administrative actions ultimately flowed from presidential authority. George W. Bush further institutionalized the unitary executive theory after September 11, 2001. His administration used 9/11 to justify expansive wartime powers under the Commander-in-Chief Clause. The Bush administration authorized surveillance and detention without warrants. Bush also issued hundreds of signing statements challenging congressional limitations, and he asserted that congressional restrictions violated the president's constitutional prerogatives. Donald Trump has brought the unitary executive idea to its most aggressive expression to date. He has claimed near total control over executive officers, and he has resisted congressional subpoenas as unconstitutional intrusions on executive independence. His legal advisors argued that the vesting clause grants the president unlimited authority over the executive branch, including independent agencies like the Federal Trade Commission and the Federal Reserve. In this framework, the president stands not as one branch among equals, but as the Constitution's central actor in executing and interpreting the laws. Across these presidential administrations, Republican conceptions of executive authority have been rooted in a philosophical defense of the Hamiltonian view of the presidency. A strong executive ensures accountability, protects national security, and strengthens democratic legitimacy. Democratic presidents have also expanded the powers of the presidency, but generally they have done so without invoking a constitutional theory to justify doing so. Their expansion has been more policy-driven and administrative rather than ideological. Bill Clinton's presidency expanded executive authority using administrative and regulatory tools to shape domestic policy in the absence of congressional cooperation. Clinton made extensive use of executive orders and regulatory rulemaking to implement environment and labor policies, and he asserted the president's role as a direct policymaker rather than merely an enforcer of congressional statutes. He also expanded the president's agenda-setting power by using the office of the president and the White House staff rather than cabinet departments as the central hub for policy development and media strategy. Clinton's willingness to employ executive privilege during investigations, particularly the Monica Lewinsky and Whitewater inquiries, further tested the boundaries of presidential confidentiality and accountability. Similarly, Barack Obama used administrative and regulatory tools to expand executive authority. Through executive actions like the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA, and the Clean Power Plan, he used administrative discretion and agency rulemaking to accomplish policy objectives blocked in Congress. Unlike Republican presidents, Obama did not claim a constitutional right to override legislative intent. Rather, he argued that the executive direction was necessary to make government function in a polarized era. While both parties have contributed to the steady expansion of presidential power, their motivations and justifications have fundamentally differed. Republican presidents emphasize constitutional design, asserting that the president's authority over the executive branch is both unitary and inherent. Their expansion of power is often framed as a restoration of the framers' original intent, or at least Hamilton's, for an energetic, decisive executive. Democratic presidents emphasize practical governance, using the executive branch's administrative machinery to achieve public policy outcomes when legislative mechanisms stall. Their expansion of authority is grounded in necessity and responsiveness to social needs, not in a theory of constitutional supremacy. The executive branch began as an experiment, a single figure entrusted with energy, but hemmed in by checks and balances. Over time, necessity, crisis, and ambition expanded the office into the centerpiece of American government. Lincoln used extraordinary powers to preserve the Union. Franklin Roosevelt redefined the presidency through economic and military leadership. Nixon demonstrated the dangers of secrecy and unchecked claims of immunity. George W. Bush expanded presidential authority in response to terrorism, reshaping constitutional norms on war and surveillance. Donald Trump has stretched the presidency in new ways, relying on partisanship, executive orders, and direct appeals to the public to sidestep traditional checks. The story of the executive branch of the government of the United States is a story of America's tension between liberty and power, between caution and necessity, and between restraint and ambition. The framers left Article 2 vague, perhaps intentionally, but they also assumed Congress and the courts would vigorously defend their own right to balance power. Whether the modern imperial presidency still reflects their vision or represents a dangerous departure from it remains one of the central constitutional debates of our time. Thank you.